Christ, all things hold together, says the letter to the Colossians. But it doesn't always look that way, does it? This has been one of those weeks, for me at least, when the evidence definitely seems to point the other way, when it's tough to see much of anything holding the world together. In France, scores of lives lost to violence during the Bastille Day celebration while fireworks popped in the sky overhead. In South Sudan, the flaring up of hostilities between rival factions, with many now suffering from scarcity of food and water, many fearing a renewed outbreak of armed conflict. In Turkey, significant loss of life in the midst of an attempted overthrow of the government and the crackdown that followed. In the US, deep confusion and uncertainty over the way forward amid systemic racism and violence, not to mention an election cycle gone all but completely mad. Of course, those are just a few of the difficult, heartbreaking stories unfolding around us right now, a few of the threads at the edge of this tattered fabric of human life. My heart is heavy this week. Maybe yours is too. And Sarah, of all things, is laughing. I will confess that this did not feel right to me this week. I'm not against laughter in church or anything, but something about this text didn't feel quite appropriate. There's so much in the world that feels heavy right now, and maybe laughter is part of what we need to help us cope. Maybe that's why the news was peppered with so many reports on Larry the cat this last week, who is apparently the current anchor of stability in the upheaval of British politics. Everything okay back there? Okay. Laughter is good. It can even be healing. But in church this week, I guess I was feeling like we needed something more. Of course, all of that assumes there's basically one kind of laugh, the kind that stand-up comics and viral YouTube clips deal in. So is that the kind of laugh that catches Sarah in the text this week? She laughs because those mysterious visitors at her tent tell Abraham that he and Sarah will conceive and bear a son, and that this will happen soon. She laughs because she's 90 years old and well past the usual age for this to happen. So I guess you can hear the laughing as laughing at a punchline. Humor is sometimes about absurdity. My son's favorite joke right now is to tell me that 3 + 3 is 10. It's funny to him because he knows it's crazy. And this news is no less crazy than bad math, really. 3 + 3 isn't 10, and 90-year-old women don't generally give birth. Sarah knows that, and maybe that's why she laughs. There's a more common way people seem to understand Sarah's laugh, and that's as a mark of disbelief, that it's a dismissive sort of chuckle. In this reading, Sarah isn't overcome with the humor of the whole thing. She's not laughing out loud, but saying to herself, yeah, right. Maybe all that time in the sun has gotten to this messenger's head. Abraham and me and a baby at our age? Not gonna happen. That's a different kind of laugh, and it would be a perfectly understandable reaction for someone in Sarah's place. It would be a perfectly understandable reaction for anyone who has waited so long for God's promises to bear fruit. But I hear it differently. I picture Sarah just inside the doorway of the tent, which is probably a spot where women have spent a lot of time throughout history, leaning in as close as they were allowed in cultures where men do the talking. I picture Sarah waiting there, wondering what these strange visitors want, listening to their conversation about where they're from and where they're going, about the route they've taken through the desert and the place they've stopped on the way. But when the talk finally turns from the pleasantries to talk of Abraham and Sarah and a child, I imagine Sarah leaning in a little bit closer, listening as carefully as she can from behind the flaps of the tent. And when she laughs, I hear it differently, because I know there is another kind of laughter. And I imagine you know it too. There's a poem I have loved for a long time by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney that names it well. It's called Postscript. and sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore in September or October when the wind and the light are working off each other so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones the surface of a slate-gray lake is lit by the earthed lightning of a flock of swans, their feathers ruffed and ruffling, white on white, their fully grown, headstrong-looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass, as big, soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. There's a kind of laughter that comes from being surprised by something so big and beautiful that you can't hope to capture it, that comes from being blindsided by joy. There's a kind of laughter that is much closer to wonder than to humor. It's the sound of the heart being caught off guard and blown open. And that is how I hear Sarah's laugh this morning. That kind of laugh is a million miles from the one you blurt out during a silly movie. It's not to say that that kind of laughter is wrong, but it's cheap. And if you ask me what we really need today, or what I need at least, it's the costly, heart-blown open kind. The kind that asks something of you, that does something to you, that leaves you changed on the other side. Of course, there is no prescription for that kind of laughter. There's no app for that. There's no store you can go to. There's no television channel that can promise to surprise you with joy in the middle of a world that has more than its share of brokenness. I can't tell you how to laugh like Sarah, but I can tell you one way to be open to it, and that's to show up. In some ways, that is the truly amazing thing in this story, the astounding way in which Abraham and Sarah show up. I know that sounds like a low bar, but let me show you what I mean. Abraham and Sarah's story with God doesn't begin here. They have been chasing God's promises for decades now. It all began when God first spoke to Abram. He had a different name back then, and God promised him a nation. In the decades since that time, this couple has been through a lot. They've left home for a long trek into the unknown. They've survived a sojourn in Egypt with the highly questionable tactic of Sarah posing as Abraham's sister and joining the harem of the Pharaoh. They've waited while Ishmael was born to Abraham and Hagar. They've waited and waited and waited. And just before the visit of these messengers, at God's order, Abraham was circumcised at the ripe old age of 99. So I think you would understand if they were almost done with chasing this promise of God to give them a child. I think any of us would understand if they were done expecting much from God. But when the travelers emerge out of the shimmering heat of a desert afternoon, Abraham and Sarah continue to do what they have always done. They continue to show up because they expect God to show up. Just notice how the story describes Abraham's actions. He wastes no time, literally running from one thing to the next, which is amazing for any 99-year-old man, but maybe particularly for a 99-year-old man who has just been circumcised a day or two ago. Abraham runs to meet the visitors, runs to tell Sarah to make the cakes, runs to select a calf from his own herd. And while the text focuses on his actions, Sarah is, of course, doing the same thing. Together they are doing what they have always done, responding to the events in front of them as though they have holy significance, refusing to give up on God's promises, showing up, and expecting something to happen. They could have responded differently, you know. Abraham could have kept on napping in the midday sun, told the visitors that he wasn't really up to guests yet. Sarah could have said, "I'm done with this God who takes God's own sweet time to accomplish anything. Let the travelers make their own cakes." They could have dismissed these visitors, but they didn't. They showed up, and while the men talked and ate, Sarah waited by the door of her tent, her hand at her ear, listening carefully. expecting something to happen. It's then, of course, that her heart is blown open. Showing up sounds like a low bar in life until you start to think about what that really means. It means hanging in there for the long haul. It means trusting in God's promises even when that trust doesn't seem logical. It means holding on to hope even when things seem pretty hopeless. It means taking ordinary strangers seriously, whether they show up at your home or at your church. It means continuing to build relationships with neighbors from different backgrounds and cultures, even when that work is challenging. It means coming back to worship week after week, even when the clouds don't always part and you don't always hear God speaking with a clear, audible voice. It means continuing to participate in political processes, even when it seems that your vote, your voice, your input doesn't make much difference. It means continuing to pray and to act and advocate for human rights and respect for human dignity and the well-being of the planet, even when it seems so much resistance is stacked against it. We do this because we believe that God is there in all people whom we meet, and because no meaningful change has ever come about easily, and because sometimes, out of the corner of an eye in worship, you do actually see the world alive with holy fire. Most of all, we do it because we trust God's promises. And when we do, when we show up for our own lives with expectation, when we run to greet a visitor or hurry up to tell a child that she is dear in the eyes of God, or persist in praying and acting for a peaceful world, when we show up as people of faith, we open ourselves to meeting this promise-keeping God and finding ourselves blindsided by grace once again. That is the beautiful sound I want to hear this week. The laugh that's maybe all but inaudible, that comes from being surprised by God's tenacious gift of life. There's no formula for it. I can't tell you just how to do it. But I'm convinced that our part is to keep showing up with trust and with hope and with expectation. And God's part is to do what God has always done, to show up in ways we never expected, to meet us again, to catch our hearts off guard and blow them open. Amen.